I am Maria Quiñonez Sanchez, a lifelong learner, advocate, and someone who adores her Puerto Rican roots and the ability to serve people. It is not lost on me as the first Latina to get elected to city council in 2008, the level of growth of the Latino population within the city of Philadelphia. And while we've made some progress, politically, we're still a very young community that still does not see itself as part of the landscape of the city of Philadelphia. Many of us, whether you're Puerto Rican who continues to travel back and forth to Puerto Rico and sees itself in that dichotomy of back and forth, or you are a new immigrant, incorporating yourself into the city of Philadelphia has not been easy. And for many of us who watch the immigration debate be born out of Pennsylvania, when you leave the city of Philadelphia proper, we have Latino communities emerging, living in very hostile situations. So we have a lot of opportunity and growth, but the engagement is not reflected in the million Latinos in Pennsylvania and the 500,000 Puerto Ricans in Pennsylvania. So there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. And I believe all the political parties do not make the kind of investment to make us feel included. And it is up to us, right? We're very good on the crisis situation, but this has to be longer and broader than that. I see us as a community that's made progress, a community will continue to grow, a community that contributes to the fabric of the city, but still is not a real part of it. The growth of the community, the growth of organizations within the city of Philadelphia, the growth of, bilingual charter schools in our community is a symptom of the lack of direct investment and intervention by government in the communities. We are growing because of the necessity and the need, right? And so we have very mature organizations that are doing a lot of great work as a result of that lack of investment that existed within government. So when you look at neighborhoods, you're starting to feel the branding. That was something that I took very seriously in my role in city council, in that there were certain community anchors that needed to be renamed, right? Ramonita Center, Julia de Burgos School, Luis Muñoz Marin, Gloria Cáceres, all of those were ways of us demonstrating that, one, we are here and that we're here to stay, and that our history and the development of the communities are important. So you see some ownership in that, right? You see some ownership in our nonprofit organizations, and now you're starting to feel it within the business sector. Carters that are better defined as Latino carters, whether it's, El Centro de Oro, Fifth Street North, Longcrest, where you see a lot of Colombian restaurants, Castor Avenue with the Portuguese community. I think there's a lot of growth and potential there. Those spaces are going to get even bigger, and how we utilize the economic power, purchasing power and business power of our community is going to be very important if we want to gain the respect of the community at large, that the Latino community is here contributing to the growth of the city, but also to the growth of the economy in the region. And it's very important that there's a recognition of who makes up the population, the Latino population in the city of Philadelphia, and how we work with each other, and then how we work with the Black community that is the majority of the city and other allies, right? The city of Philadelphia is majority Puerto Rican. And quite frankly, when you look at the political discourse, we don't have a Puerto Rican agenda. And we saw that during Hurricane Maria and Irma in Puerto Rico, that crisis pulled us together, but there isn't a long-term Puerto Rican conversation. For instance, in Chicago, there's a Puerto Rican agenda. At the same time, there have been a lot of groups that are forming their own organizations, which I've always supported. Dominican Business Association, Dominican Festival, Casa Venezuela was celebrating, 25 years, and I was there on day one, because I do think there is a time to be Puerto Rican, there is a time to be Latina, just like there's a time to be a woman, and then there's a time to be an ally in a Black and brown space. I think we are still an isolated community among ourselves as groups, but also in the broader scale. And that's part of the maturity that happens with communities. So I still think there's a lot of work around how do we collaborate with the Colombian community, with the growing Venezuelan community? How do we collaborate, but also uplift those stories as to why people got here, right? The immigrant story in Pennsylvania, for instance, is not very different than the Puerto Rican story that was here. And so sometimes we think the work that we're doing just impacts our community because we really haven't had that shared historical content about how we all got here, right? And how the struggles of these new immigrants is not very different than the Puerto Rican struggle. Let's learn from each other and let's create those tables in those spaces where we can have a collective agenda, but also uplift those stories that get those communities here. So I think that the political agendas and how we get here are important for us. That's why sharing the history of who and how people got here is important, because then we'll understand that this national campaign where democracy, the saving of democracy, for the Puerto Rican community, we're one of the last remaining colonies of the United States, right? So when you hear this conversation about we have to save democracy, I'm like, we've never had it, right? We come to the United States and that colonial mentality, we often joke about what happens on that plane ride, right? Because when you go to Puerto Rico, what you see is an entrepreneur spirit, people who hustle, people who work hard, per capita, we have more scientists than, many parts of the world. So it's sort of like, what happens in that transition? Why do we lose the sense of self? And that's no different than other communities who come here and feel like they have to assimilate, right? And have to fight, for their immigration status. We don't. But having second-class citizenship is not much better than having your green card. Collectively, we have not gotten the respect of the United States, again, about what we contribute to the United States in terms of workforce. And the problem is the ability of the United States to exploit a people. We need these workers, right? But we don't want to give them their full citizenship. Puerto Ricans have never had full citizenship here, right? Because of that colonial relationship. Understanding people's stories, I think, will align us politically better. My father was a farm worker. That's how my family gets here. That's not different than all of those families that are now in Kennett Square and Westchester and other places. And why can't that shared story help us have a shared agenda around, the integrity and the value of people and their contributions here in the United States? And that's a collective job that we have to do together. The colonial status of Puerto Rico as defined by the United Nations. There is a worldwide acceptance of the fact that Puerto Rico has a colonial status. This Commonwealth definition that we have been sold does not provide for Puerto Ricans to have equality or the democracy that we so much talk about here in the United States. Puerto Ricans do not have the ability to vote for president, right? And with that comes no representation without taxation, right? So then there's tax benefits to that American and worldwide companies have been able to exploit because of the relationship where you're born under an American flag and therefore you have certain entitlements, but they're not equal. Puerto Rico does not receive the same level of federal funding or health reimbursements that all the other parts of the United States receives. Puerto Rico cannot control its borders. We're part of the natural resources, no different than how we treat national parks, how we treat the Liberty Bell. That's where the conversations of Puerto Rico happen, right? We're not an equal. We don't have the power or the self-determination to be able to define what we want this relationship with the United States to be. We're in the midst of a national election. Puerto Rican's going to have the right to select and define what Puerto Rico wants to be in the future. And you have this huge statehood movement. They want to be state. You have the folks who were originally part of the Commonwealth who now know they have to redefine themselves, and others like me that believe we can create an associated republic that is different than anything that's there. Like this notion that we have to pick a status that currently exists versus a status that allows us to keep our language. Not being honest with el pueblo de Puerto Rico about those options, because we're only reviewing the options that have existed versus saying democracy has evolved, the world has evolved. What can Puerto Rico contribute to the United States, and how can its people have a process of self-determination? There's the pathway to that. And that's been missing, and that's what creates this uncertainty. There are now 7 million Puerto Ricans around the world. And so there are more people now living outside Puerto Rico than Puerto Rico. And the diaspora, what is their involvement in this new definition? And we have to own our land. And you now have Americans using Puerto Rico as a tax shelter, not paying federal taxes, not paying state taxes, not paying local taxes, and you see the impact of the displacement of Puerto Ricans as a result of that. It's much more expensive. Per capita, we're poorer than Mississippi. And the ability to move back and forth creates this uncertainty that is reflected in our lack of participation politically also, because it's like, where do we belong? Why do we have to conform and not create a new history for ourselves? So when you look at the data, and it's really hard, data mining has become more sophisticated. And so I know that there are ways that people can drill down on Latino names, Latino surnames, to parcel out, Puerto Ricans versus others. Puerto Ricans are the majority of the Latinos. We're still 60% of the population, and we have the ability to vote, and there are more Puerto Ricans registered. Number-wise, I believe we will always be the majority because of that reality, right? You have people who, new immigrants, who have to wait to become citizens and then vote. Because Dominicans have the ability to vote in La República and vote here. So there's this recognition that they are Dominicans with this authority that once you're an American citizen, but you can still vote in Santo Domingo. That doesn't happen for Puerto Ricans, right? So I know Puerto Ricans that make a decision to vote in Puerto Rico and not vote here because they're worried about their families in Puerto Rico. So they have to make a choice. So that leads to that uncertainty. So Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania are the supermajority. We do, because of our ability to vote, the numbers will always be bigger. Percentage-wise, they should be much more. Our turnout would be 25% in our communities. Now that's dismal compared to the rest of the city that would vote 60-65%. We lived in mixed communities now, so you no longer, the barrio is very diverse in and of itself. But when we didn't have a Latino on the ballot, that turnout could be as low as 8%. So that told you that when people identify and feel seen and heard by elected officials, there's a bigger engagement. But we're still nowhere compared to the majority of the city. I do think the enthusiasm of others who fight for the ability to vote, Venezuelans, because of what's happening in Venezuela, they know that their vote here matters because they have to influence Congress. Colombians and others, the enthusiasm is different because of their pathway. But Puerto Ricans on the island vote almost 90%. So politics is a sport in Puerto Rico, but the Puerto Ricans there are engaged, right? And they're voting for their island versus the Puerto Ricans here who don't feel as included, right? And therefore are not as engaged, right? And I think the other immigrant groups are going to add to our ability to grow those numbers, so that we can have better engagement of our communities. The fact that you can vote in Puerto Rico and vote here, I think that would be a game changer for us. And that is one of the things that I really respect about the Dominican community and the leadership in them creating that opportunity and understanding that their diaspora and their investment and their growth is dependent on their diaspora. So one is maturity, and the generation, once you're a second, third generation, is going to continue to change. I have a lot of faith, and as much as, I have a millennial son and I have a Gen Z son who grew up understanding that they had a vote, right? They had a mother that was active, but who is going to make sure that their children are more activated. And I think we are now at third, fourth generation for Puerto Ricans, and we have to instill that within our young people. And they looked at activism, and by the way, their expectations of their elected officials, their bar is much higher, and they're better informed because, again, they have the world at their fingertips, right? The internet, the ability to look up anything. You look at Israel and the Palestine situation. When you look at Venezuela and the election challenges there, Puerto Rico's not that far from that. And if we don't vote here and have Congress people who understand our stories and our struggles, then we will get lost. Why do we have to lose who we are to be included? I think that conversation has evolved, and I think young people, and this millennials in particular, and now Gen Zs, and then Generation Alpha that's coming, I think they're going to change that. My hope is that they see their activism as something that is their civic duty, because their glass ceilings, I used to say this all the time, we have very successful Puerto Ricans and Latinos, but I used to tell them, your glass ceiling is still the barrio. You have the ability to move away, but that corporate glass ceiling, that business glass ceiling, that, redlining of investments from banks and others is still the barrio. So, but historically, when you understand the context of all of this, we've moved very far, I would say, in the last 20, 30 years. And I think millennials, Gen Zs, and Gen Alpha are going to they're storming their way through. We have the ability to help the young generation do it their way. But I also think that our older generation plays a role and has to play a role, because if our young people do not understand the history and the challenges that they faced, we will be destined to repeat it. And so it's not an either or, it's sort of every generation does things differently. Understanding the context, the historical context of their struggle is so important for the new generation, right? For my Gen Z son, he grew up with Obama being president. He didn't live how difficult it was for Obama to become president, right? He grew up with that. He gets away with not understanding the political, for my family, coming here as a farm worker, for me being the first in my family to go to college, that is an important connection that he has to make. We need to invest in our young people differently because they're going to do things differently, but we owe it to the trailblazers and our ancestors to give them the context of that history, so that we don't repeat it again. Hearing the stories from real people, to me, is more impactful than just Googling something that says, oh, this person was the first person to open a nonprofit organization. Those histories are important that our young people understand. We have to make that connection with folks. And I want them to love and know those histories of who they are.